Welcome to Module 9, and in this first lesson we're going to be looking at creating clean lines or creating clean line art as we talk about finishing our drawings, bringing them up to a professional level. In front of us we have a rough drawing of a girl. She was busy doing track, she was busy jogging or something, and suddenly she summoned a fireball of some sort. She got it, and she's in a state of shock. We've caught her at the moment where she's realized she has this ability and the force of it's blowing her hair back, and she's a little bit stunned at this. All right, so we have our rough drawing here, and we want to bring it to a place of clean lines, right? We want to bring the lines to a nice clean state. But before we do that, we need to take some notes and follow some guidelines before we get there. And the first thing I want to reiterate, and you've heard me say this countless times throughout the course, is looseness, right? Looseness. There is perhaps no greater boon to your drawing abilities than being loose. All right, so in order to do clean lines, we need to be very loose with our arms. We need to draw with our arms, not with our wrists necessarily, unless it's a very small area, and get the lines being nice and smooth. They get that smoothness from the speed, and they also taper nicely at the ends from that speed, right? We want looseness, and also loose lines are dynamic lines, right? Dynamic lines appear to have a sense of directionality to them, and a dynamic line is appealing, where a static line that's drawn slowly is not appealing. All right, so it lacks appeal, and it's one of those elements of the buffalo, so to speak, right? We want to use this as another thing to use. We want to use all of the things, use all of the buffalo, right? As Brad Bird says, and really get our lines nice and loose. So even the very lines that we draw with, we want to apply our shape theories to of looseness and dynamism. All right, so looseness is extremely important. The next thing I want to reiterate in our notes is that rough and refined stage thinking. All right, and the mindset. Module 5, lesson 1, where we discuss rough and refined, and I talked about, good food being made in a kitchen is not very neat in there. It's very messy, but when you receive it at the restaurant, it's beautiful and it tastes nice and the presentation's good. We want to have that same sort of mindset when we're doing our rough. Rough is about planning, and refined is about being loose and free, a little bit more creative, but we want to focus now on cleaning up and detailing well and keeping things neat and clean and presentable. Okay, so you want to change gears when you're moving into doing clean lines or refined lines on your piece. All right, then the next thing that I want to mention is that we want to do base lines first. Okay, and this is non-weighted. All right, non-weighted lines. So we don't want to do the line weights yet. We just want to do the base lines first, and then we want to move into line weighting, perhaps on a separate layer if you're working digitally, or after you've done the basic lines on your drawing on traditional, right? We do the line weighting after. And tying into all of this is that we want to draw thin lines, right? Or fairly thin lines. And the reason is it's much easier to thicken a line than it is to thin a line. All right, so these are our basic guidelines. All right, these are our basic guidelines when it comes to creating clean line art. Now, you're going to find, let's get into this now, you're going to find that you may not be super good at doing this initially when you want to create clean lines freehand. And doing it freehand is the narrow gate, if you will. It's the road less traveled, because it's really hard to do clean lines freehand without quite a substantial amount of practice moving your hand to get those lines very clean. But it's certainly the more rewarding road, and at the end of the day, you will be much more efficient than someone perhaps using Illustrator or someone doing 1,000 billion undos to get each line perfect. So I still personally undo a lot, but you will undo far less and you'll be far more efficient at drawing clean lines freehand. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a layer on top. Let's call this layer clean lines. If you're on paper, you will want to have a nice refined rough. This is a little bit unrefined. You want to have a more refined rough, and then you want to simply do your clean lines on a new piece of paper on top. But here we're going to do the clean lines on a layer on top of our rough lines. We're going to drop the opacity of our rough lines quite substantially here, so that we can see the clean lines. And using our notes, let's in fact bring our notes, scale our notes down so we can see them while we're doing this. Right. We're going to kind of, and digitally, working digitally, it's piece dependent, but usually on an A3 page, I'm working at about 4 or 3 line thickness, right, in terms of the pixel, the brush weighting of the line. But you'll want to work with thinner lines, right? Always remember, thinner lines, we want to do our base lines first and then our line weighting after, so that we can have some control over our line weighting, more control over our line weighting if we draw thin lines. And additionally, if you're moving into painting your piece or coloring your piece, thinner lines are generally preferred. Of course, it's based on the style. You might want to do a style that has really ludicrously thick lines, right? So of course go for it then. But generally speaking, if you wanted to look painterly afterwards or whatnot, you want to consider thinner lines if your intention is to make the lines disappear. Right. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to very loosely draw in the side of her head, and the movements that I'm doing is that I'm using my arm to draw first of all, and I'm making sure that I'm trying to draw quickly and using a single stroke, right? I don't want this to look like rough, clean line work, which we will cover in the next video. I want this to look like clean line work, right? We want it to be very clean and have a look of precision and confidence about it. And so what I do is I try as much as possible to use a single stroke. I'm very quick. I try to be quick with the lines. You can see what I'm doing here, because I want that effect of the line tapering. All right. And let me note as well that similarly to traditional, I'd be using a brush in Photoshop. Here I'm using my own brush called Inca Flatter, which is really just a solid color brush that has size on the pen pressure, right? There is no opacity change in my line work here or in the actual ink. It's always black, right? No matter how hard or soft I press, it stays pitch black, much like an inking pen. Nevertheless, I try to move very quickly, and I'm going to just very quickly get these details in. Let me just see, I changed the structure a little bit there. I'll just draw it again. And I'm focusing on moving quickly. Right. Now, when it comes to her eyes here, because it is quite thick in the rough, I'm going to thicken up my brush. And I will be a little bit strokey, if I can say, or a little bit scratchy, just because the eyelashes tend to have little bits of details poking out of them, you know, the little lash lines and little hairs and things. And so if the upper lid line is a little rough looking, it's not the end of the world, because it kind of matches, right, as well as the low lid line to some extent, because you've got those little hairs poking out, right? And you can see I've quite thick weighting on the eyes, but that's generally the only place I would have slightly thicker weighting. Otherwise, the rest of the areas, we will return back to our thin lines. Let's draw in the nose. And once again, I'm back to one stroking, right? I just want to one stroke everything. If I don't get it, I undo and I try again. Let me say while I'm doing this, I am working on a Wacom Cintiq tablet. That means I'm drawing on the display. And this will be particularly hard for you, especially if you're a beginner, if you're using a Wacom tablet, because the hand-eye coordination is not as accurate on those devices as it is when you're looking at it and drawing on it as if it's right in front of you. Now, don't be discouraged, because fortunately Photoshop has made advances in the last few years where they've included the ability to rotate your canvas, right? And Photoshop's rotation tool is R, and then you can just simply click and drag. So if you're on tablet, and I also do it very often on this particular Cintiq, that is a useful tool to helping you line out quite quickly. We'll draw in her lid line there and her lid line here. And so we'd move through the piece, drawing in each of these elements, trying to be as accurate as possible, trying to be as quick as possible, using our arms to draw, and so on and so forth. All right. And then we'd move on to the line weighting phase, which we would put on a separate layer. I see I've done half of this on the notes layer. It's not the end of the world, but then on a separate layer, we would do the line weighting. And I'm going to rotate this page here to do the line weighting. And the beauty of doing your weighting on a separate layer is that you can then control the weighting much more easily for, first of all, where if you make a mistake, you can easily erase just the weighting and not actually touch the base drawing, which you've hopefully already completed in terms of its base line weighting. But additionally, when you do the line weighting on a separate layer, you are able to be more efficient at weighting, because when you look at the base work unweighted, you can decide the key areas where you need to weight. But if you're weighting the lines as you're doing the cleanup, you end up perhaps overweighting some areas and the whole piece seems equally weighted everywhere almost. And you've added line weights and you've spent time adding line weights to places that probably really didn't need it or it really didn't matter much. So it's also more efficient to weight after you've done your baseline your baselines. All right. And so this is basically the process we want to use. Now you might be saying, well, I'm really bad at drawing these smooth lines. I'm still new and I need lots of practice. So how can I get clean lines if I can't do this yet without doing 8,000 undos? And you're going to get hand cramps when you do that many undos, right? Well, first of all, I would say practice is the best medicine for this. You really want to just keep doing it, keep practicing. Try and get your hand and your arm used to having the arm doing the lines. Lock your wrist, let the arm do the lines, and you can get some great smooth lines. Ultimately, a lot of drawing really is just S curves, C curves, slight curves, and that's pretty much it in straight lines. So it's not like there's thousands of different ways to draw the lines. You're just kind of combining them. But I know that perhaps you may be antsy and you want to get straight to it. So I do have a solution for you. Some software out there, and the software I'm going to show you today is Clip Studio Paint, has the ability on their inking tools, right? So here I've chosen the pen on the left-hand side. This is Clip Studio Paint Pro over here. And I'm using the turn-up pen, but many of their pens have this option. They have the ability here for stabilization, line stabilization. Now, at its current setting, it draws very much like Photoshop. It will require me to use my arm a lot to get smooth lines. But as I ramp this line stabilization value up, let's take it to something really high, like 70. What it does is, it draws in the line a few milliseconds up to, I think, a few seconds after you've drawn the line, and it smooths the line out, and it kind of follows where you want it to go. So you can't see my hand moving on the tablet as I draw this line, but effectively, as I draw this line for the side of her face, I'm finished drawing the line before this application has ended the line. I'm already finished drawing it, and it draws it in afterwards. And it makes drawing clean lines very quick and easy without you having to do too many undos. So this is also a very good solution for efficiency, but also if you find that you're really struggling to get those clean lines, get an application like Clip Studio Paint Pro. I think not Open Canvas, Paint Tool Sci also has line stabilization, and a few other applications have line stabilization in them. So check to see the feature set of that. Clip Studio Paint is actually really nicely priced, so I must say I can highly recommend this. You can see here, I can just get these all in one go. But perhaps I'm being a purist. I would still advise striving to develop the ability yourself to just freehand very clean lines. Now, before we end, let me show you one more great thing you might want to consider doing, particularly if you're working digitally when you're creating your clean line art. Over here, I have a picture of my piece called Gwendia, and her line weighting is done and her line art is done. And she looks pretty cool, but there's a problem with digital. Digital tends to be very sharp by default. Everything is very sharp and very edgy, and it takes a bit of the natural look away from the work. But there is a wonderful trick you can do when you're working digitally that I can say traditionally almost comes by default traditionally. Inks kind of bleed at a kind of micron level on the page. You can't really see it that much, but there's a vibe of it, of what we're about to do. So here's the final lines on the layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate these lines. So now I've got 2 final lines layers. Let's call this one second layer. Okay, so there's 2 final lines. You can see the piece got really dark. And I'm going to put the second layer behind the first layer. So there's the final lines layer there. Just put in that L. And I'm going to put this second layer here. And I'm going to now go into the filter menu, and many applications have this capability. I'm going to go to the blur menu here. I'm going to select a Gaussian blur. It may be different per application, but you can play around with it and see where that option is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a slight blur to the lines below my main lines. All right, just a slight blur. And here I'm really just playing with the slider. So if I take the blur off, you can see how sharp and edgy my clean line art looks. Maybe too sharp. But as I blur this lower layer, I can add a gentleness or a softness to my lines, making them look exceptionally professional. This is one of my top tricks, one of my top secrets. Sometimes I'll even lower the opacity a little bit if I don't want the effect to be too strong, but I still want it there. And let's see when we take it off and on. Very sharp, much softer. When you look at the entire piece in its entirety, well, from that distance it doesn't seem that appealing. But believe you me, it makes all the difference in the world. And in terms of lighting as well, if you are familiar with lighting terminology, what it does do is, in a sense, it almost adds a sense of ambient occlusion to your lines, right? It really softens the lines up. So with it off, with it on, with it off, with it on, and when you get to coloring, it makes all the difference in the world on the piece to have the lines not so razor sharp like this. The sharpness kind of looks cool in a sense, but when you start coloring it just looks so digital. And if you want it just to look a little bit more natural, you can soften those lines in the background. That is the end of the lesson. I hope it's been useful to you. Please practice it, and I'll see you in the next lesson.